welcome you to this CCC press briefing. This press briefing falls under our alternative government agenda. President Nelson Chamisa said at the start of the year that as the alternative, we're going to continuously analyze policy by the regime. We are going to expose challenges, and we're also going to proffer solutions so that the citizens can get a feel for what government under the CCC will look like. Now, it's a huge matter of regret that on Saturday night, President Mr Mnangagwa unveiled a cocktail of measures that have created huge policy confusion throughout the country. The measures can best be described as an assault on trade, an assault on commerce, which will obviously lead to chaos within the economy, which will be most felt by the common person, the ordinary citizen in the street. Now, it's the man who once said that Zimbabwe is open for business that has done the exact opposite and effectively closed the nation for business, severely hampering all business activity. And beyond any doubt, it's clear to everyone that we've got a huge problem in the economy. So I'm going to structure this press briefing in three parts. I'm going to deal first with the economic context. Then I'm going to speak to the key features in the measures, especially the ones that are most problematic for the common person. And then finally, I'm going to look at alternatives and what the CCC is going to do in order to address these. So let's start with the economic context. Zimbabwe's economy is in tailspin. There's absolutely no doubt about it. Teachers are incapacitated, so are doctors, so are nurses, so are police officers, so are soldiers, civil servants, or workers. Every single citizen can feel in their pocket the policy failure when it comes to the economy. Even the student movement, we have seen that they've launched Fees Must Fall. It's because the value of the currency has been depleted so significantly that it's causing huge problems for those who want to pay for goods and services, including school fees. What we've also seen is that there's a huge lack of confidence in the Zimbabwe dollar. Citizens simply don't have confidence or faith in whether you call it a bond note, whether you call it RTGS, by whatever name called. There's very little confidence left in the Zimbabwe dollar. The demand for the US dollar as a store for future value remains high, and confirmation of this is the exponential increase in the parallel forex rate. This is unsurprising given the history of the economy. We all know that just as recently as 2016, the same people who are in charge of the economy now are the same people who told us that bond notes were an export incentive. They're the same people that told us that the bond note would be 1:1 with the US dollar. They are the same people that told us that the bank deposits that we held as USD would not be affected by this new policy change. It's the same people who placed a cap on how many bond notes would be in the economy. They lied to us then, and they're lying to us again. It's the same people who presided over the mess of 2008 and Zimbabwe's world-famous hyperinflation history. We also have seen, like I've indicated, a runaway exchange rate and obviously a skyrocketing stock exchange where people are trying to find some sort of refuge in the stock market. Hyperinflation is now the highest in the world according to economic experts. The official statistics indicate that year-on-year inflation is about 96%. That's for April, up from 61% at the start of the year. This is mainly due to a rapidly weakened Zimbabwe dollar. Other analysts have also opined that the inflation rate is much higher than this, and it's in the 3-digit range. They've also said that Zimbabwe's hyperinflation is the highest in the world, higher than even Venezuela. Now, we also see, when looking at the economic context, that the exchange rate has depreciated by about 100% during just the last 2 weeks. There's been a huge spike in the price of goods. Right now, when you go into a supermarket wanting to shop, $10 can't even buy you a bag of mealie meal and cooking oil. That shows you just how bad the economy has got for the ordinary citizen. The cost of living is beyond the reach for the majority of the population, and we obviously know that because the data supports it. The World Bank has set our extreme poverty rate at 49% of the population. This means that about 1 in 2 Zimbabweans is living under extreme poverty. We are all familiar with the currency chaos. We all know, or the lawyers will know, that under Section 317, subsection 1 of the Constitution, the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe has a duty to protect the currency of Zimbabwe in the interests of economic growth. What the announcement of Saturday night and the subsequent announcement by Mr Mnangagwa on Monday show is that the RBZ has grossly failed in its constitutional duty to protect the currency in the interests of economic growth. Now I'll come to the second part of my presentation. What are the key features of these measures that were announced? Now, on Saturday night, Mr Mnangagwa did something that's very unprecedented. As we all know, we are a constitutional democracy. Under Section 68 of the Constitution, every public official, whether you call yourself the president right down to the lowest civil servant, has an obligation to act within the framework of the law. The rule of law is sacrosanct. What this means is that you cannot, as a public official, just wake up one day or in the middle of the night, stand up and say that this is the new rule. Because we believe, and our constitution is underpinned by the separation of powers doctrine, the primary law-making function rests with Parliament. So rule by decree is unconstitutional. It's unlawful. It violates inter alia Section 68 and other provisions of the Constitution. But notwithstanding this clear legal imperative, we saw Mr Mnangagwa introduce a raft of ill-thought-out, knee-jerk measures, what the RBZ calls a national announcement. Now, that creature of a national announcement is foreign to our law. It simply doesn't exist. Some analysts have said that policies pronounced by night fall apart during the day. And what the last couple of days, last 3 or 4 days, have shown us is that this policy is grossly irrational, and it's already started to cause shockwaves in the economy. Now, the most outstanding feature of Mr Mnangagwa's announcement is the freeze on all lending, whether by banks, microfinance institutions, building societies. All lending has been suspended, and this has been done indefinitely. There is simply no law that allows even the Reserve Bank to suspend all lending, to interfere with private contracts, to interfere with commerce to the point of hampering and halting all business activities. Curiously, Mr Mnangagwa said that these measures were designed to stabilize and bring confidence to the economy. It's been anything but that. Following the announcement by Mr Mnangagwa, on the 9th of May, the RBZ fleshed out the announcement by issuing a directive wherein it ordered the immediate suspension of lending by bank institutions, building societies, development finance institutions, basically everybody. Nobody is allowed to lend. This is a first in the world. Mr Mnangagwa said that the suspension relates to all lending, whether in local currency or foreign currency, to government, to the private sector, to corporates, to legal entities, and to individuals. There simply is going to be no lending allowed anymore in Zimbabwe in terms of this unlawful directive. In fact, the directive actually says, to borrow the term he uses, the freeze covers any form of borrowing by whatever name called. So you simply cannot come up with any sort of stratagem to deal with this block on lending. I'm going to speak shortly to why this is going to cause shockwaves to the economy. Concerning pipeline transactions, another curious remark was made by the RBZ to the effect that lenders had to approach the RBZ for consideration on a case-by-case basis. Now, the difficulty we have there is what criteria is going to be used to allow other people to lend and other people not to. There's a huge potential for abuse, selective application of the directive, and other problems where, there will be punishment of certain business entities while other ones, we know the ones, are allowed to lend and to borrow. Now I move to the next part. Why are these measures problematic? Why is it that we as the CCC are saying that, Houston, we've got a big problem here? The first issue is that most commercial actors have already warned that the lending freeze would hurt Zimbabwe's already fragile economy. Surprisingly, but maybe not so surprisingly, Mr. Mnangagwa's announcement did not produce any facts, any figures to justify, based on empirical evidence, the lending ban. This is something that lawyers will call grossly irrational administrative conduct. What are the figures that tell us that it's lending that has caused the run in the exchange rate? Nothing of the sort was presented to the citizens, and we're all none the wiser today after the announcement. And so what the announcement has created is fresh uncertainty over an already uncertain economy. I've already indicated that it's unprecedented. You simply don't see it anywhere in the world where you're just told, suspend all lending to anyone whatsoever. All of your contracts are immediately stopped just because of a simple press announcement. We highlight that the timing could not be worse. The measures come in the middle of the preparations for our winter crop, when most farmers are drawing down, borrowing on their facilities to ensure that we've got a decent farming season. None of that was taken into account when Mr. Mnangagwa issued his unlawful, invalid directive on the 7th of May. It is economically unsound, loaded with political rhetoric, which simply does not match the reality on the ground. And we hasten to say that, when analyzing this unlawful announcement by Mr. Mnangagwa, followed by another unlawful announcement by Mr. Mnangagwa, we must bear in mind the kind of regime we are dealing with. It's a regime that's used to acting outside the confines of the Constitution. It's a regime that's used to acting outside the provisions of the law. It's a regime that does not even know that it's bound by the provisions of Section 3 of the Administrative Justice Act, which oblige it to always give notice before handing down such an adverse policy directive that's going to send shockwaves to everyone. The people, the affected stakeholders, the citizens, the banks, the corporate entities have a right to be consulted as a matter of law before such a measure is undertaken. None of this was done, and it's clear beyond any doubt that Mr. Mnangagwa was acting beyond what is legally permissible. We see that the nation is now bearing the brunt of a problematic forex auction system. The citizens must be angered by this, because when issue was raised against the forex auction, the fact that it did not stand to reason, it didn't make sense, they called it an auction, but it was not an auction in the true sense. It was over-regulated, bore no relation to the actual value of money. The citizens were called all sorts of names by the regime, and yet now here we are. Their system has completely imploded and failed. We see that the policy was to subsidize importers up to 50% while printing money. That's the root cause of the run in the rate. A failed auction system is part of the root cause of the run in the rate, not the explanation that's being given by Mr. Mnangagwa, political rhetoric around economic saboteurs. That's simply not borne out by the evidence. Now, what does this mean for investment? Zimbabwe is now riskier, deathly uncertain, and volatile with low returns. This means that it's highly unlikely that we're going to be able to attract big capital to this country. The ZNCC, the National Chamber of Commerce, has already warned that the measures will give rise to a parallel banking system with usurious interest rates. No investor is going to be attracted to an economy where lending can be suspended overnight by an announcement by a person just standing at his desk that he just does not feel like lending should be allowed anymore, not based on data, no notice given, the terms of contracts aren't given any considerations. Businesses rely on borrowing for short-term financing and operational needs. Lending is required to import raw materials, pay salaries for working capital requirements, and for machinery. It's therefore clear that the suspension of this lending will adversely affect the viability and solvency of companies who, without notice, have been told to unilaterally shrink their working capital base. Now let's look at what the figures say on this particular issue. Productive sector loans constitute almost 76% of total bank lending, meaning that about 70 billion Zimbabwe dollars of credit has been impacted by this unlawful announcement. The measures thus have obvious catastrophic consequences. For some, it will mean they will not be able to make a simple electronic transfer of money until they've extinguished their overdraft facilities. Which company was ever planning or budgeting for such a shock to their system? The measures will also negatively impact on productivity and capacity utilization. No economy can survive without access to working capital. Analysts have also warned that there's a strong likelihood that an underground lending economy will emerge, driven by both greed and sympathy. We all know how the black market operates in Zimbabwe. Zimbabweans are known to always make a plan and to adjust, but the risk continues to get higher and the fundamentals of the economy continue to get weaker, if that is possible. Now, we also see a problem, as I've indicated, with the potential selective application of this announcement. Which entities are going to be allowed to lend? What does the case-by-case requirement actually mean? Who will be given authority? What factors are going to be taken into account? That's the difficulty with implementing a policy like this without reference to any law. The law, as a matter of constitutional principles, has to be certain and positive. People must know what principles bind them before those principles are unleashed on them as a directive or a diktat. Now, coming to the viability of banks, the interest income of banks has now been threatened. Lending is banks' core business. Interest income constitutes for most 40% at least of the total revenue for the bank, and it's their biggest source of income. Analysts have reported that the government suspension of bank lending could wipe out between 20 to 50% of the income of banks. And so we can see very clearly that the data tells us that this new policy measure spells disaster for our economy. It also is going to create another black market operation within the banking system and could push banks to engage in non-permissible activities to compensate for their loss of income. The economic measures also risk triggering huge disruptions in the goods market, which is likely to create shortages, very much like what we saw in 2008. If companies can't be viable, if they don't have a sufficient working capital base, it's going to be very difficult for us to see goods on the shelves unless they act outside the confines of this directive. We see that the government has no comprehensive plan to address the ever-growing number of poor citizens, the inflation, the erosion of wages. What was shockingly absent from Mr Mnangagwa's statement is any plan to address the continued suffering of Zimbabweans who barely can afford basic transport to go to work, to put food on the table, to pay school fees for their children, to access health care. His economic measures, so-called, are completely silent on what is in it for the ordinary citizen on the street. All we are going to see following this economic measures, disaster, are further distortions, and we're already seeing it with Zimra, for example. The forex rate that they're using has shot up from $165 to $275. This is clearly a recipe for super taxation. Now, what do we say as the CCC as an alternative and the way forward? Now, we've consistently said that the problem in Zimbabwe, the root cause of all these issues that we face, whether it's a poorly run economy, the crisis in the public transport sector, the breakdown of our hospitals, our school system that's now completely dilapidated, our broken and worn out infrastructure, all of that points to a failure in leadership. So, as a long-term measure, we continue to impress upon the citizens that the only way we can see sustainable change in Zimbabwe that will affect the daily life of Zimbabweans is to ensure that we install ethical leadership in 2023. So on this note, we continue to implore the citizens to do everything necessary to ensure that they're registered to vote, so that we've got leaders who can actively take into account the welfare of the citizens, consult before making policy announcements such as this, and also take into account the suffering of the masses before policies are made. There are a lot of industry questions that have been asked, and we call upon the regime to take these questions seriously. A key question that's been asked is, what is the roadmap? Mr Mnangagwa the other day said, look, this is just a short-term measure. What does that mean? And how does commerce plan with that sort of announcement in place? So we call for them to set out a clear roadmap concerning these measures. Consult widely. In fact, in the new Zimbabwe, before a measure that's going to affect the entire economy is implemented, there'll be wide consultation of big business, of small business, of workers, of all affected stakeholders, because that's the only way you can ensure that you've got sound policies in place. But concerning this immediate issue, the regime has to quickly take steps to consult the banking sector, come up with a framework that actually works before we have another earthquake. We've seen several earthquakes in the economy, the hyperinflation of 2008, the bond notes crisis, the breakdown of our pension system and the erosion of all pension values. So to avoid those sort of shocks from continuing, let's quickly consult everyone. There's a need to ensure that there's a proper legal framework in place for whatever steps are going to be taken to reconcile and restore confidence in the Zimbabwean currency or to dollarize. President Nelson Chamisa is on record saying that for now, while we build confidence, let's dollarize. For now, to ensure that we've got a credible currency and a currency that the citizens can have confidence in. Let's dollarize while we come up with a currency board, while we come up with measures to ensure that we have a functional Zimbabwe dollar currency. And along with this, I mean, we saw what was done during the GNU by Honorable Tendai Biti. We saw that when you've got a government that's actually sincere about carrying out an economic policy that benefits the many and not the few, you won't have these sort of shocks. When the GNU was in effect and Honorable Tendai Biti was in charge of the finance ministry, you would not have these knee-jerk, ill-thought-out, arbitrary, capricious measures being unleashed onto the citizens in the dark of night. That approach to governance and leadership urgently has to change. Along with that, there's an urgent need to fix the fundamentals. There's a need to address the root cause of our economic difficulties, the failure by the regime to respect property rights, the failure to have a bona fide currency system which is not dogged by arbitrage for, fat cats, to take away all the corruption. We've seen, the illicit financial flows that take place. All of that has a huge impact on how the economy is run. There has to be clarity on all measures around a timeline. What does success look like? And what are the citizens to expect in the future? It's critical that Parliament holds the regime to account, and as the Triple C, we all know that Honourable Tendai Biti is leading the Finance Committee in Parliament. Issue is being taken as we speak, even today, during question time with the ministers. Questions are going to be asked concerning the efficacy, legality, propriety of these regulations. So on that note, I just wish to close by saying that what Mr Mnangagwa demonstrated on the 9th of the 7th of May is that he has no care whatsoever for the welfare of citizens. He is not in touch with the reality of commerce in Zimbabwe. And so we continue to call upon everyone. What we need to solve the entirety of these problems is to ensure that we install a government that serves the people and not just a few. Thank you.
Yes, well, as you were speaking, you say that these measures that were put in place by the president were illegal and there is no piece of legislation that gives them the right to do so. As a party, I wanted to find out from you, ma'am, what are you going to do about it since we have a legal channel that we can follow to ensure that that problem is rectified?
I'm aware that there is current legal action that's being contemplated, and obviously the key stakeholders that would need to lead that process from a locus standi perspective are those directly affected, so the lending institutions themselves. I'm also aware of efforts to mediate and negotiate with the governor to ensure that these measures are effectively set aside because it's not sustainable for the long term. We're also going to use the power that we have in Parliament. We're all aware that the Triple C is now present in Parliament to use the parliamentary tools of holding the executive to account to ensure that these measures are addressed. No other questions? Okay, so with that, I'd like to thank you very, very much. We are going to maintain a policy watch on these measures. Please may you stay glued to our channels to see what we're going to be saying, what we're going to be doing, and the continued offering of alternative solutions in as far as these economic measures is concerned. Thank you very much.